The ceasefire between Israel and Hamas in Gaza has ultimately collapsed.
Israel ends Gaza, truce with strikes, blaming Hamas for breakdown.
We wish we could say otherwise, but in truth, this hasn't come as a surprise. In a past video here on VisualPolitik, we already told you how the ceasefire in Gaza was very fragile, and that the plan seemed designed precisely to fail. Thus, during the early hours of Tuesday, 18th of March, Israel once again launched massive airstrikes as part of a campaign with a very representative name, Might and Sword. And on Thursday, we knew that ground attacks had resumed as well. In other words, the war has been reactivated.
Israel has restarted airstrikes on the Gaza Strip as ceasefire talks and negotiations for the release of hostages held by Hamas have stalled.
This time, Israel has struck again, with force. But in this video, what we want to do is tell you why the truce has failed and why the war has resumed again. Pay attention to everything we're about to tell you. First of all, for those of you who aren't quite aware of what the hell the ceasefire was all about, I think we need to talk a little bit about it, because logically, this is key to understanding why everything has now blown up. The truce between Israel and Hamas came into effect on Sunday, January 19th, thanks to a negotiated plan that recognized at least 3 phases. 2 initial phases of 42 days each, and a third phase with an indefinite duration. How did they move from one phase to the other? Well, both Israel and Hamas had agreed to meet on the 16th day of each phase to negotiate the entry into force of the next phase. Well, that has never happened. Israel and Hamas never negotiated the second part of the ceasefire. They limited themselves to stretching out the chewing gum and extending the first phase for 2 weeks, until ultimately everything has kicked off again. Strictly speaking, although the fighting will not resume, the truce had already ended on the 2nd of March, which is also not to say that nothing will happen. After that day, Israel cut off all supplies of food, medicine, fuel, and electricity to Gaza as a way of pressuring Hamas to accept a new proposal before reaching the second phase of the ceasefire. In other words, the enormous risk that everything would end up exploding, as has finally happened, has been evident for weeks. But as I know the phases can be a bit of a mess, and many of you may not know what the agreement consisted of, let me explain it to you a little bit so that you can fully understand everything that has happened. Well, as we said, the ceasefire so far was still in the first phase. According to the agreement, during this period, Israel and Hamas would exchange Israeli hostages for Palestinian prisoners. What's more, Israel would withdraw its troops from the Netzarim corridor through the Gaza Strip, redeploying them to the border area and allowing more humanitarian aid to enter. Basically, that was it. And it was a fairly achievable scenario. In fact, Hamas has released 25 Israeli hostages during this period out of the 33 envisaged for the first phase of the agreement. For its part, Israel has released almost 2,000 Palestinian prisoners from its jails. The problem, as we were saying, is that this phase of the ceasefire should have ended more than 2 weeks ago to give way to the second phase. A new stage in which the total withdrawal of Israeli troops from Gaza was envisaged in such a way as to return, more or less, to the situation prior to the terrible attacks of 7th of October 2023. So basically, let's not fool ourselves. If Hamas had followed the route it had taken, it would most likely have retaken control of the Strip, reorganized its political and military structures, and would have tried to pretend that nothing had happened. Yes, I know, in this case, they would regain control over a practically razed Gaza, but also over a very damaged population, among which it would be extremely easy to find new members willing to fight against Israel to seek revenge. And that is something that Israel has always said it will not allow under any circumstances.
I'm not going to agree to end the war before we remove Hamas. We're not going to leave them in power in Gaza, 30 miles from Tel Aviv. It's not going to happen.
In short, the transition from the first to the second phase was very complicated, if not impossible, as we explained here on VisualPolitik back in January. In order for this to be possible, Hamas would have to agree to abandon its political aspirations altogether. Of course, they could also try to reach some middle ground, in which they would be allowed to be part of a new government, which, let's just say, would not be totally controlled by them. But right now, even that possibility is absolutely non-negotiable for Israel. And all this could lead to a dead end. An impasse that could end the ceasefire, and with the Israelis trying to take back the rest of the hostages by force. Well, that's just what's been happening lately. Check it out.
Tonight, we returned to fighting in Gaza in light of Hamas's refusal to release the hostages and amid its threats to harm IDF soldiers and Israeli communities. We will not stop fighting until all of the hostages return home and all the war's aims are achieved.
At this time, 59 hostages are still being held by Hamas, of whom Israel believes only 24 are alive. Of course, now comes the question, the crucial question in this whole mess. What exactly has happened during the last 2 weeks that has suddenly caused everything to blow up again? Who's to blame for the failure of the ceasefire plan? Well, we're going to explain all this and more today. Pay close attention, because there are some sharp curves ahead.
Responsibility boomerang.
VisualPolitik community, let's be very clear. The ceasefire has failed equally due to both Hamas and Israel. You see, according to the agreement, the truce could only be formally renewed if both sides agreed to end the war. But Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was against resuming talks if they were not aimed at the full demilitarization and voluntary demobilization of Hamas. Something that, let's see, makes all the sense in the world and coincides exactly with what Bibi himself promised in the aftermath of 7th of October. In fact, that's why we found it so unlikely that the truce would last. But of course, the problem was that Hamas was not in the mood. So, as the time to negotiate the second phase approached, the mistrust between the two sides grew stronger and stronger. So much so that, according to a senior military commander speaking on condition of anonymity, Israel has had evidence for days that Hamas is planning to carry out fresh attacks. Specifically, attacks against Israeli troops in the Gaza border buffer zone. And there was even talk of a possible incursion into Israeli communities, similar to the attack on 7th of October 2023 that triggered the entire war. And take note, because this is information that has also been backed up by Israeli intelligence, which it claims has uncovered alleged Hamas preparations to carry out all these actions. So naturally, instead of waiting to see whether or not these were serious threats, this time Israel has decided to swoop in to prevent this possibility. Now, this is the Israeli version. The problem is that there is a lot more to this. For starters, what would you think if I told you that the US was unilaterally trying to work out a new agreement with Israel?
U.S. gives Israel and Hamas new proposal to extend Gaza ceasefire.
VisualPolitik community, instead of following the original roadmap and negotiating the second phase of the ceasefire as planned, White House Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff has been negotiating with Israel for an additional truce of up to 50 days in duration. This proposal was then presented to Hamas as is, for them to accept it, and in exchange, they demanded that they release at least 5 hostages alive and another 9 dead bodies on the first day. And from then on, they would progressively have to continue to release the rest of the hostages. In other words, in a sense, this new truce in reality would have been an extension of the first phase of the agreement. And the question is, why on earth extend the first phase instead of trying to move on to the second? Well, I guess you can imagine by now. We've told you before, in the current situation, Israel basically controls the entire strip. It controls the Philadelphia corridor, which is the border between Gaza and Egypt, and which is vital for Israel, as this is where most of Hamas's weapons enter, and it also completely controls Gaza's entire border with Israel. So, Jerusalem saw an opportunity. If they could get Hamas to release the rest of the hostages without giving up all those strategic advantages in Gaza, the hostage problem would be over. Netanyahu would have had a fresh popularity boost because he would have succeeded in bringing his people home without Hamas regaining control of the strip. And after all the hostages were accounted for, well, you don't have to be an expert to see it. Without Israeli hostages in the hands of Hamas, the terrorist group would be sold out. Their negotiating strength would be gone, and that would give Israel a free hand to try to finish them off in any way possible. For instance, by blowing up one of the tunnels that this organization uses as hideouts. Of course, this is easier said than done. In all the time that has passed since October 7th, Israel has been unable to defeat Hamas, not least because Hamas is an ever-changing terrorist group. In any case, getting the hostages back and not allowing Hamas to regain control would be a powerful political coup for Netanyahu, and that is exactly what he's trying to do. Now, you know what the problem is. Hamas saw the move and said, no way. They want to stick to the original agreement and negotiate the second phase that would force Israel out of Gaza, and that's when the trouble came. But there's even more to this story. As the US and Israel prepared this new proposal, it has come to light that Adam Boehler, the US presidential envoy for hostage affairs, has been maintaining secret contacts with the Palestinian terrorist group.
Exclusive. U.S. holding secret talks with Hamas.
To give you an idea, this is the first time since Washington designated Hamas as a terrorist group in 1997 that there have been direct talks between the two sides. In fact, unless it's all theatrics, which, let's face it, anything could be possible, what is known is that the government of Israel is extremely angry about this matter. Although the Americans say that they were consulted beforehand, it doesn't seem that the Israelis were amused.
U.S. envoys' secret talks with Hamas angered Netanyahu administration.
Now, what did the United States intend by talking directly to Hamas? Well, you see, the thing is that 5 of the hostages still held by Hamas have dual citizenship. They are both Israeli and American. Only one of them is still alive. And so, according to existing information, the White House would have tried to reach an agreement with the terrorist group to hand over these people. But not surprisingly, negotiating behind Netanyahu's back, I don't think that would sit well with King Bibi. And here's where we come to the second part of the story. Probably the most interesting part, because the fact that the war has been reactivated also has a lot to do with what is going on inside Israel right now. Yeah, you heard me correctly. We're about to tell you all about it.
Convenience and pressures.
The political situation in Israel is gradually becoming more and more unbearable. The families of the remaining hostages in Gaza are increasingly mobilized to demand that Netanyahu do whatever it takes to bring their loved ones home. At the same time, Netanyahu, as you know, governs in a coalition with the religious Zionists, who do not want the military pressure on Hamas to be lowered under any circumstances. And in the midst of all that, we have Netanyahu's own corruption trials. Well, this past Tuesday, just after the resumption of the attacks on Gaza, this news broke out.
Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu will not testify as planned in his corruption trial on Tuesday, following Israel's surprise attack on the Gaza Strip.
Of course, we cannot say that the cause of Netanyahu's decision to resume attacks in Gaza is the pending trials, but the timing has certainly worked to his advantage. For those of you who don't know, the Israeli Prime Minister is facing 3 separate corruption cases for alleged fraud, bribery, and breach of trust. If convicted of all these charges, the Prime Minister could face more than 10 years in prison, along with financial penalties. We're talking about a trial that has been hanging around Netanyahu for 5 years now, and it doesn't look like it will end anytime soon. And keep in mind that he is probably one of the 3 most important leaders in the history of Israel. But well, the fact is that over the last 5 years, Netanyahu has done everything to try to prevent the trial from coming to an end. He has even tried to pass a huge and controversial judicial reform that gave the government much greater control over the judiciary, including the appointment of judges. In the end, however, the Supreme Court annulled the reform. And so, at the time of October 7th attacks, Bibi was not exactly at his best, neither in political terms nor in terms of popularity. Then the Hamas attack pushed his approval ratings to the bottom of the sea. But not surprisingly, the successive wave of victories over Hezbollah, Syria, Iran, and Hamas have brought him back to the top. And yes, the war also contributed to delaying the progress of the trials. And when the issue was restarted, wham! The ceasefire ends again. But that's not all. Just a few days ago, the Israeli Prime Minister began maneuvering to remove Ronen Bar, the director of the Shin Bet, Israel's domestic intelligence service. And this is just another in the string of senior officials Netanyahu has fired or forced to resign in recent months. Now, why does he want to kick him out? And why is this important? Well, the official reason given by the Prime Minister is the lack of confidence and the need to get rid of all the job positions that failed to prevent the attacks of 7th of October 2023. As we've already told you some time ago on VisualPolitik, both the Shin Bet and the military intelligence failed miserably. So there are many reasons to dismiss him, and there's not much to say. Now the problem is that the main motive may not be that. Since last February, the Shin Bet has been investigating links between some Netanyahu advisors and the state of Qatar.
Shin Bet launches inquiry into Netanyahu aide's ties with Qatar.
Netanyahu's former spokesperson reportedly even received money from Doha in exchange for classified documents, and also for trying to create pro-Qatari news through some of Israel's leading journalists. We aren't talking about Netanyahu, but about some of his trusted advisors, which, logically in political terms, would taint him. And that has set some tongues wagging that this could be a clear additional motive for getting a hand in Shin Bet. But we haven't even finished telling you everything. As we were saying, the situation of the Israeli government is torn between the pressure of the families of the hostages, who enjoy considerable social support, and their political allies of religious Zionism. Stay tuned for more information.
Far-right Otzma Yehudit, returning to the government after resumption of war in Gaza.
Less than 2 months ago, on the occasion of the Gaza ceasefire with which he disagreed, the hitherto Minister of National Security, Itamar Ben-Gvir, left the coalition. Well, now he's back. Ben-Gvir's party and Netanyahu's Likud have just confirmed that the ministers of Jewish power will resume their ministerial portfolios that Netanyahu had reserved for them, assigning them to other active ministers instead of giving them to new people. So all this could have been foreseen well in advance. Don't forget that when it comes to political moves, Netanyahu knows them all. Now, what does this mean? Basically, 2 things. The first is that Netanyahu has once again increased the number of supporters of his government, shutting down any hint of a political crisis. And then, on the other hand, the return of these ministers to their posts may indicate that the return to military force in Gaza is not something that is going to end in a day or two, but could be a long time coming. Basically, because Ben-Gvir's people are not going to be in and out of government every week, and it's likely that they have received assurances that the military campaign will continue. Obviously, all this is very bad news for Gazans, and has also caused some hostage families to release such strong comments as these.
As we feared, Netanyahu, in order to preserve his coalition and strengthen his rule, launched an attack on Hamas in Gaza, not to bring back the hostages, but to bring Ben-Gvir back into the government.
What is clear is that now both Jewish Power and the religious Zionist Party are once again aligned with Netanyahu in the strategy of war against Hamas. And that means that the Israeli government is once again cohesive, at a high price, but cohesive. So given all these advantages, with more political support, with corruption trials slowing down again, and so on, Netanyahu is probably not exactly in a hurry to resolve the war in Gaza now that it has been revived. In fact, he doesn't even have significant international pressure to do so, because the only country whose opinion matters to Israel has come out strongly in support of them.
An Israeli official said that President Trump gave Israel the green light to restart attacks on Hamas after it failed to give up hostages. Israel then gave the US a heads up before starting the operation.
In short, with US support and a newly strengthened government, Netanyahu has little reason to stop the attacks. But of course, it doesn't make sense that the war is going to last forever. So the question is, where do things stand at this point? Well, Israel's strategy now is going to be to force Hamas to disarm and perhaps agree to a political transition plan for Gaza, which is likely to see an occupation and a simmering war for quite some time. VisualPolitik community, the reality is that everything has returned to a point of great uncertainty. Hamas has no intention of losing control over Gaza, and Israel has no intention of letting Hamas continue to control it. It's an ugly train wreck. Worst of all this movement has come at a time when thousands of Gazans were returning to their homes, or what is left of them. This means that the ceasefire has caught many civilians scattered along the strip outside safe areas, which could increase the number of casualties. Therefore, in the next few days, it's likely that some kind of agreement will be reached to return these people to safe areas and then continue the fighting. In any case, right now, there's a lot of uncertainty about what might happen. And if one thing seems clear, it's that the future of Gaza looks worse and worse. At VisualPolitik, we're going to be paying very close attention to everything that happens in order to tell you in detail. But for now, it's all over to you. What do you think of the end of the ceasefire in Gaza? Could this conflict drag on again for months and months? Or are we facing a strategy of military pressure to force a new agreement? Do you think the resumption of the war favors Netanyahu? Leave us your thoughts below in the comments and let's start a debate. It's sure to be a hot one. And of course, if you like the video, hit the like button and subscribe to VisualPolitik if you haven't already done so. You know, it's free and it helps us a lot. As always, thank you very much for being there. All the best. See you next time.